Good morning to those in the United States joining us and here in our headquarters at Washington, D.C. for the Atlantic Council. Good afternoon to those in Africa and beyond. My name is Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council of the United States. Today, I'm delighted to welcome you to an important discussion on the state of democracy in Africa. Democracy is a core theme of our work across our 16 programs and centers, and there could be no one better to speak about this than our first speaker of the day, Dr. Mo Ibrahim, who established the Ibrahim Foundation, the Mo Ibrahim Foundation that focuses on better governance in Africa, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. He's also created the Ibrahim Index of African Governance. In 2023, the Africa Center launched a flagship series dedicated to special topics. The first conversation looked at Africa and the war in Ukraine. It was followed by a second conversation analyzing Africa and the BRICS countries. Today's topic of conversation is the state of democracy in Africa, and this is the third edition of this series. The timing of this event couldn't be better. The Financial Times calls 2024, quote, the most intense and cacophonous 12 months of democracy the world has seen since the idea was minted more than 2,500 years ago. Now that may sound hyperbolic, but foreign policy has joined the FT, saying the coming year will see a global battle between democracy and autocracy play out literally at the polls. What's undeniable is that the rest of the world will see more significant elections embracing more democratic countries in the world than I can ever remember. It's also happening at a time when democracies have been on the defensive, and countries like China, Russia, and Iran have been acting more boldly. Some 2 billion people will vote in 2024. That's about half the world's adult population, representing more than 60% of global gross domestic product by Bank of America calculations. The FT reports that 70 countries will be holding elections, including 8 of the world's 10 most populous countries, and 20 elections will take place on the African continent alone. There won't be this grouping, an important grouping, large grouping of elections again until 2048. That may sound like a reason for celebration, underscoring the enduring attraction of democracy, but it is also a time of peril when democracies need to find ways to counteract a recession in democratic rights and freedoms that's been underway globally since 2006, according to Freedom House. What are the reasons for these setbacks? How can we talk about the solutions? These are issues we talk about every day at the Atlantic Council. This also comes at a time when innovative technologies like artificial intelligence can be forces for progress and forces for democracy, but they can even be used as effective tools for surveillance and control by autocrats. Over the past 4 years, Africa has seen coups and military transitions across Gabon, Niger, Burkina Faso, Chad, Guinea, Mali, and Sudan. These events have resulted variously from flawed elections, attempts to change constitutional term limits, the inability of civilian governments to effectively address security and development challenges. The news is not all doom and gloom. Despite recent coups and growing challenges to democracy, Africa has had successful elections and transitions in places like Nigeria and Liberia. At the same time, we are seeing strong grassroots activism across the continent of Africa, reflecting the dynamic commitment of African youth that successfully ousted authoritarian regimes from Sudan to Burkina Faso. According to a report of Afrobarometer, 7 out of 10 Africans say they prefer democracy over any other kind of government, reflecting a growing demand for social, economic, and political change. These themes flavor much of the work of the day-to-day challenges at the Africa Center through its Sudan Task Force, focus on the Sahel region, and support for rule of law across the African continent. With that as background, it's my pleasure to introduce our opening speaker today, Dr. Mo Ibrahim, founder and chair of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, and most recently knighted, so he's now Sir Mo, or Sir Mohammed. So we can talk to him about that as well. Dr. Ibrahim established the Mo Ibrahim Foundation in 2006 to support good governance and exceptional leadership on the African continent. In 2007, he established the Mo Ibrahim Prize for Achievement in African Leadership, a $5 million prize for African heads of state and government that deliver for their people and transfer power to successors. Alongside his work to advance the critical importance of governance and leadership, he's enjoyed a distinguished business career with a Pan-African vision and global impact. In 1989, he founded Mobile Systems International, a world-leading cellular consulting and software provider. In 1998, Celtel International, one of Africa's leading mobile phone companies, which pioneered mobile services in Africa. He's a founding chairman of Satya Capital Limited, a private investment firm focused on Africa. So this is a true business philanthropist. He's received numerous honorary degrees and fellowships from a range of prestigious academic institutions. Before turning to Dr. Ibrahim, I'd like to acknowledge our moderator today for the panel that will follow him, and Constance Berry Newman. Constance is the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. Today, she chairs the African Renaissance and Diaspora Network, as well as serving as non-resident senior fellow, and we're very proud of that here at the Atlantic Council. There's no one better to navigate this discussion than Constance, who continues to analyze these trends, and she'll introduce her illustrious panel when Dr. Ibrahim has finished with his remarks. Dr. Ibrahim, it's an honor to have you with us here at the Atlantic Council, if only virtually, and a warm welcome. We look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for your kind words, and I'm really grateful for the Atlantic Council to ask me to join your conversation. The question in front of us is the state of democracy in Africa, and I can answer that in a very short sentence. It is bad and deteriorating, unfortunately. We have seen a continuous deterioration of freedoms and the space for civil society. You know, we produce the index of governance, and we try to measure various parameters on governance, including participation and rights of citizens. And this has been deteriorating for the last 5 years or so, unfortunately. This year, we have 17 elections. Of course, Egypt just had one before the end of the year, so we're not counting it. And some countries were not sure what they're going to do. Those was run by military guys. That sounds like a fantastic number for 17 countries to have elections. But if we dig a little bit into that numbers, we'll see that out of 17 countries, only 7 have term limits. The rest either never had term limits or modified or changed term limits to enable incumbents to continue in office. So that's, of course, one problem. About 58% of the population of the 17 countries are eligible to vote. But unfortunately, there are some problems here. First one is the lack of proof of identity. Some 500 million people of Africa, that's 1/3 of our population, don't have proof of identity. So they cannot register, they cannot vote. So that takes out 1/3 of the eligible voters. Really, just lost their voting rights. Other problem we have also is the logistics. In a recent survey by Afrobarometers, an astonishing number, 50% of the respondents said they could not find their polling station. Just not know where to go and vote. An example of what happened in the latest election in DRC, recent election. 27 of the polling stations did not even open. And of those who opened, 45% of the polling the machines did not work. They malfunctioned. 45% of the voting machines malfunctioned. So another problem is the logistics, and all this combined raises a big question about really the democratic process in our countries. Young people in Africa who are really the largest constituency, many of them, most of them are engaged, aware what's going on. Unfortunately, they don't vote in large numbers because they lost faith in the process. They don't lose faith in the democracy. Democracy is popular. If you ask people in Africa which system of governance you like, they will say democracy, but they don't recognize their own system as a democratic system because of abuse of power and misrule. So many of them, unfortunately, decide just to ignore elections and the process, and we lose that. The phenomena of a strong man has started to spread widely in Africa, and it's not surprising in a way because those guys look around the world and see the rise of all those strong men everywhere. You can look around, a lot of strong men coming around, autocratic and strong leaders. That became, unfortunately, fashionable. It didn't help us as well that the leader of the democratic world, the example we always hold for our people in Africa, the United States, itself has issues with its democracy. I mean, quite a large number of people, relatively large number of people, still believe that the election was stolen. So they don't have faith in the electoral process. And the Congress is so politically polarized, it cannot really function. Nothing happens there. And then the legal, the judiciary has become so politicized. This is a Trump judge, this is Obama judge. And I mean, sorry, a judge is a judge. And Supreme Court became a political tool, unfortunately. So it doesn't help us in Africa because we always use US as an example to convince our people and our leaders that democracy is a wonderful way to go forward. But we lost the shining example of the city of the hill, unfortunately. So there is all these factors around us which are affecting what is going on in Africa. We'll continue to fight for democracy, for human rights, and it's just tough. And we need your help, guys, in US. Thank you.
So I am the moderator, Constance Newman, and just welcome a wonderful panel and the audience, virtual and in person. I want to introduce the panel in somewhat an odd way, which is I'm just going to give the titles, and I'm not going to pronounce their names. A couple of years ago, I was moderating a panel with one person who was brown, and the other guy his name was black. Both of them complained how I pronounced their name. I said, that's it. I'm not pronouncing any more names. So let me just start with Chris. He is a senior associate and regional director for Central and West Africa, the National Democratic Institute. Chris, say your name.
Chris Fomonyo.
Thank you.
Thanks, Connie.
Okay. All right, so the next person is the director of the African Studies Program, School of Foreign Service, Georgetown University.
I'm Lara Smith. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Okay. And the next is the president of the International Republican Institute.
I know you know how to say my name because you're on the IRI board. Dan Twining.
Yeah,
Great to be with you, Connie.
All right. So now we are introducing the coordinator for a movement in Burkina. I know he's on his phone. Let's see if he's connected. I mean, you all are so high tech. He probably is. Okay. Oh, hello. You want to say your name, please?
Ouedraogo Suleiman.
Thank you very much. Now, before we go to the panel, you should know that we conducted a small survey to see what people were thinking about in terms of the status of democracy in Africa. So I'm just going to have you look at a few questions. The first one, do recent election outcomes indicate that democracy is getting stronger across Africa? Those of you who didn't participate, do you agree with that answer? 75% said no. Next question, should Western support and development assistance to Africa be linked to democratic requirements? 68.2, yes. And the third question, if you live in a democracy, do you think that democratic governance improves your life? If you don't live in a democracy, do you think it would improve your life? Whoa, 90% with yes. Frankly, that kind of surprises me, but we'll move on to see what else is surprising that we talk about today. Chris, I'm going to start with you. What do you think is the current state of democracy in Africa?
Well, thank you very much, Connie, for having me, and I really want to express my appreciation to the Atlantic Council and the Africa Center here for hosting this very timely conversation about the state of democracy in Africa. We've got 1.4 billion people, the majority of whom are aspiring for democracy and who are struggling to make democracy take root. The state of democracy in Africa today, I would say, as Sir Mo said earlier, demands a lot of concern. Democracy is not doing well. We've seen better days. We remember when apartheid collapsed in South Africa and Nelson Mandela came out of prison. There was a lot of euphoria. We remember when Namibia had its independence. We remember when there were national conferences across the continent. And everybody was so enthusiastic that democracy would take root. Unfortunately, in the past 3-4 years, we've seen a lot of backsliding. And I think I would say democracy needs its own life support in a number of countries. It needs a lot more oxygen.
Laura, take the same question.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. I would also like to echo my appreciation for the opportunity to speak. Thank you to the Atlantic Council and to my panelists for the opportunity to join you in this important conversation. I think, certainly I would agree with Chris and with Dr. Ibrahim to share these concerns. I think I would also echo that democracy is strained globally, right? And so although there are things that are really unique on the continent and that it's important to consider that, it's really important to contextualize it within a global kind of strain. Some of the points that Dr. Ibrahim made about the rise of populist leaders and the rise in distrust in political institutions in a number of places where we've not seen that before. And we live in a world where those things influence all of us. But certainly, yes, on the continent, I also think that we all share a concern about the state of democracy, the trust in institutions, in addition to the points that have already been made, the way that those institutions may or may not deliver for citizens the kinds of outcomes. I think Senegal is a really interesting place. Kenya, where have institutions like the courts been able to sort of deliver democratic outcomes, and where are they in the process? as we speak of sort of helping to deliver for citizens. And also, really echoing back to the 90s, as Chris said, where do citizens take to the street to demand that their democracy deliver for them?
Thank you. Dan?
So Connie, I'm very pleased to be here, including with you and Sir Mo and our colleague from Ouagadougou, a city where I lived for 3 years, once upon a time. Just stepping back for a minute, I think there are a couple things we just distinguish. One is the demand for democracy and rights and voice and accountability is growing and stronger than ever. The supply of effective democratic governance is not necessarily. So your polls reflect this very accurately. Nearly everybody would rather live in an effective and strong democracy. We saw in the Afrobarometer poll growing support for military intervention when democracy fails or does not deliver. That's not a preference for autocracy. That's an understanding of, I'm afraid, a sad reality, which is that leaders may come to power, including through elections. There are no other effective democratic institutions, and they do not serve the public interest in power. That corrodes support, not for democracy, but for them. The other point to make, I think, just up front here is let's look at Africa's richest, most prosperous, most successful societies. They are open and free societies, right? Kenya, Ghana, South Africa, they all have their problems. No country is perfect, but in fact, we do not see any successful autocratic development stories in Africa that are enduring. Most autocracies in Africa, as in the world, end up poor and broken and at war with their own citizens and not delivering the goods.
Thank you. Sylvan, I want to take you down a different path with two questions, and I'll just combine them so that you can talk generally to both of them. The first one is using Burkina Faso as an example. What do the citizens want and expect regarding the promotion of the return to the state of democracy? And then while you're thinking about that and talking about that, also build into your conversation exactly how you believe the regional organizations can play a meaningful role in the environment that making it more conducive to democracy. So really appreciate your answer in the context of your experience in Burkina Faso.
Okay, thank you. I apologize for the quality of my English. I will start by saying that citizens in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Niger, are well aware that sooner or later we will have to return to the rules of law and democratic rules. So they organize themselves. We organize ourselves in formal and informal settings, civil society organization, to share information and our visions of the trajectory of our country should take. So the vision of the trajectory our country should take. We are fighting against ignorance, obscurantism, and the spread of false information, likely to cause serious disruption to social cohesion. Citizens are setting up resilience and self-support initiative in this difficult context where freedom of expression is limited and many compatriots are victims of the humanitarian crisis. We are taking the flame of hope alight so that alternatives exist alongside the official doxa. And second, the African Union and ECOWAS must put an end to double standards in management of domestic political crises. Resolutely take a standard in support of countries to provide solutions to political, social, economic, and institutional crises that lead to revolution of popular uprising rebellion, and worse still, military coup d'etat. These institutions, African Union and ECOWAS, must work to put an end to the lack of autonomy or independence and to the economic, financial, and social constraints that generate distrust and disaffection among citizens. Readapt, revise, and promote various instruments such as the African Charter on Democracy and Election, the ECOWAS Protocol on Democracy and Good Governance, the Bamako Declaration of November 3, 2000, so as to put an end to Western or Chinese influence and spark an intellectual revolution to devise our solution and defend our vision of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dan, could you talk a bit about, answer the question whether elections in Africa are now an indication of whether or not democracy is strengthening or weakening?
So I really appreciated, Connie, Sermo's point in his introduction about failures of election administration. Yeah. Chris and I were in Nigeria together for the last elections with you, and we saw this in real time. Right. Poll stations not opening, polling machines not working, ID issues that suppressed the vote. Election administration is one test. It's certainly not the only test, or even arguably the most important test, right? Part of, I think, our problem is that elections have been conflated with democracy. Elections are necessary but not sufficient. They are essential. But in a democracy, you have checks and balances. You have countervailing institutions. So for instance, you have a strong parliament that can check and balance executive power. You have independent judges. You have free media. Citizens have rights vested in the law. A lot of those things are absent in many African countries that otherwise do hold elections. Mm-hmm. So we need to make that distinction. We also have seen, together in Nigeria and many other countries over the years, the intensity, especially for young people, to have their voices heard and to see their votes count. And I think what's very aggravating to many of us is when we see that elections are happening and young people's voices are not being heard, young people feel like the field is not level, that in some cases the system is rigged against them, and it does create this alienation that we have seen. So I would argue, yes, of course, let's focus very much on electoral integrity and holding election officials accountable, but let's think about how to create an ecosystem so that when we have an election, there is a legitimate outcome. That's the harder work.
Thank you. I'm going to skip over you, Laura, because I got a tough one coming up for you. Okay, but Chris, same question.
Yes, I would echo what Dan just said with regards to the fact that elections do not a democracy make, and I think it's really important how we message about elections. But at the same time, they are a critical pillar in terms of democratic governance. Because all too often, and we've seen this even from empirical data, that a government that comes into power through flawed elections is likely to become very autocratic as a government. Yeah. Because it recognizes that its own legitimacy is not certain, and therefore has to take other measures to try to stay in power. Right. So a good election is a boost for every government that comes to power, but it doesn't guarantee the sustainability of good governance for the duration of the term. And I think that's a constant reminder that we need to share with political elites to realize that even after you've been elected, you still have to govern in a way that gives citizens confidence that their demands are being heard, that their voices are being heard, that public services are being properly delivered. And that's why, and that explains some of the frustrations that come through the polls that you all conducted. Which really show that even governments that were elected democratically have not delivered. Even young people who mobilize themselves to get into the electoral process, at the end of the day, have felt very disenchanted, very disillusioned, and that's why democracy is, taking a toll or in decline in a number of countries.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. I think this fits you, this question, because it's to ask you what tools can be provided for youth and other citizens to bolster democracy? What is it? What needs to happen to get this next generation to be better than us?
Well, there's probably a lot of answers to that, so I'll just suggest a couple, and others can think of them. I mean, I think certainly, as has been mentioned, the role of youth in civil society activities. So, the conditions for free speech and participation is crucial. But I actually do work on sort of the between election education process, right? So the civic education that's happening in high schools and university education. And that's a really kind of underappreciated and exciting space where youth are educated to become future citizens. And so there's really wonderful tools within that for citizens to be educated about these processes. And I often hear from high school teachers there that they'll say exactly what you said, which is, my students will ask me questions and we've failed, but I tell them they'll do better than us, and they'll do better than us in this way and that way. And so, I think, the education, what Nanjala Nyabala talks about as political education, right? So it's civic education, it's political education. It's certainly through expanding the media. Media tools are crucial to that. So a free media space or a freer media space is important. But I think one other thing that we haven't talked about, maybe we'll want to, within all of this, is also, sort of the economic aspect of the democratic demands, right? So youth also want an outcome from democracy, right? And that outcome is often jobs or employment or some kind of economic improvement. So when they're disillusioned with democracy, it's both maybe they're not able to get to the poll, but when they're saying we don't see something back from it, right? The back from it is an improvement in their life, either a job or some other kind of economic improvement. And so that's part of, the tools is sort of thinking about how we connect political outcomes with the life that people are seeking, and improvements in their life, which is often jobs or economic improvements as well. And so we have to think more about what that means. I think the examples of the countries that have had some improvement, right, like Kenya, or places that are struggling like South Africa, right? The rub is often around jobs and employment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I want this next few minutes to be a little more open-ended, starting with you, Dan. So if someone said, I'm putting together a panel to discuss democracy in Africa, what would you think that panel ought to be thinking about and talking about? And what examples can you give that drive you to think about democracy in Africa in a certain way?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. Again, I would step back and say, you know what? Within a decade, Africa is going to have a larger workforce than China or India. Yeah. That soon Africa is going to have a quarter of the world's population, a third of its young people. If we don't get democracy and governance right here, it's going to be in danger everywhere. Africa could be an extraordinary development and success story, including for democracy and freedom, or it could go the wrong way. So there's a lot at stake. These issues touch us through migration, through economic growth, through all sorts of things. Conflict, obviously, conflict which is spreading. Sudan is producing more refugees than any other conflict in the world, including the extraordinary war in Europe, which is the biggest war in Europe since World War II. There are more refugees out of Sudan because of broken governance and civil discord. So we all have a stake. The last thing I'd say, Connie, why should Americans care? Well, Chinese are intervening very actively. Russians are intervening very actively. Saudi, UAE, Turkey, India, everybody's playing in this space. In some cases for good, in some cases for ill. And so we need to be in the game, helping make sure that there is an African story that contributes to global stability and prosperity and development and democracy.
So, Chris, do you have a way you want to push back on what he has just said, or question him, or how it makes you think about this topic?
Well, I couldn't really push back because
Thank you.
he's the president of an organization. A sister
No, that
organization.
we're all
But
equals here.
Yes, that's true. But I just also because I agree with what Dan is saying, because I think there is an inherent, desire for democracy and freedom and liberties in the African spirit. That's what the whole fight against colonialism was about. That's what the whole fight for independence was about. That's why the fight against apartheid, the national conferences that I refer to, there's always a desire to be able to govern themselves, to have more liberty, to have more freedom, to have freedom of speech, of association. And so I think my issue would be two fronts. One is messaging to the political elites that even if you get elected, you don't have to capture for yourselves and a small cohort of people what is supposed to be the public space, the public resources, the public good. You can't take all of that hostage. And then secondly, broaden the conversation to say, how can we consolidate the gains that have been made? Because when you look back at the past 2-3 decades, there have been incremental gains. For example, we're talking about elections. Look at what citizen observers are doing across Africa. Domestic election observation wasn't there 2 or 3 decades ago. It's a new phenomenon. But citizen organizations, civic organizations across Africa have embraced this. And some of them are doing excellent work.
Yeah.
Look at the work we saw in Nigeria, in Kenya, even in Zimbabwe, in terms of parallel vote tabulation, where citizens organize themselves, they tally the election results, and they're able to cross-check the work of the election commission. This is phenomenal. Look at all the civic and voter education that takes place in between elections. Look at a number of women who are now very interested in engaging in the political process, and some of them have gotten elected, including presidents. So we do have some progress, but the challenge, I think, for the continent is how do we consolidate what has been accomplished and build upon that so that the next generation wouldn't be fighting the battles that we already won, but they'll be doing better and they'll be having better services and better service delivery and more space to organize themselves than we currently have.
Yeah, Laura.
Can I jump in on this? I mean, I really agree with all of this, and I also think, to an important point that you've made about sort of the future of the continent in terms of the number of people and markets and sort of how the world sees it. I mean, part of what we've seen in the last few years that underlies this, right, is a growing kind of great power competition, right? And that's both positive and negative for different countries on the continent, right? And I think it also is positive and negative for places like the United States or other parts of the West to sort of see it in that way. But I think the view from the continent, when we look at things like Afrobarometer, is that citizens on the continent really don't want to see it in that particular way, right? They see a value in different development models, but overall, as you pointed out, they see a value in democracy, right? So they're interested in engaging with different partners to accomplish that, but they see the value in democracy and they're really interested in development outcomes. And so, the key for those who want to partner with countries is to think about how to deliver outcomes that bring those kinds of economic development goals through democratic means, right? And so that is things like employment creation, infrastructure, debt refinancing and relief, climate goals, which we haven't even talked about, right, in ways that are really sort of partnership oriented, which also itself reflects democratic, values. So just something to sort of chime in.
So, we had a question that we debated about and people argued with us about, which you're almost touching on it, so I want to explore it, which is, what is the African vision of democracy? That's real broad. I mean, what is the U.S. vision of democracy? Then you get into, well, what's democracy? What should it be? But if you're thinking about it in the context of a continent that is in the process of developing, is that democracy different depending on where the development is, where the economy is? What makes it people to look at it in a different way?
Do you want to go to our friend in Ouagadougou? Is that for the Americans?
Yeah. do you want, are you interested in answering that? That'd be
Yes,
terrific.
sure.
That's a great idea.
Okay, thank you. In my point of view, in any case, democracy is neither alien to Africa, nor radically rejected, since the various constitutions and charters of transition incorporate it. And various studies, we just talked about it, but various studies carried out a continental scale show that the majority of young people agree that democracy is preferable to any other form of government. Historically, most of pre-colonial African nations were organized along the lines of the British parliamentary monarchy, as illustrated by the map of Manden in the 13th century. City affairs were discussed, decided, and settled around, can say, round trees, with the participation of the people, of the representative. Power was delegated, and there was already a form of election of chiefs who were then enthroned. The African vision of democracy is contained in various instruments. I talk about it, such as African Charters of Democracy and Election, the ECOWAS Protocol on Democracy and Good Governance, the Bamako Declaration, etc., etc. The state parties undertake to implement the present charter in accordance with the principles set out below. The vision is not negotiable: respect for human rights, respect for constitution, separation of powers, transparency and justice in the management of public affairs. No matter what anyone says, Africans love the freedom to think, the freedom to express themselves, the right to choose the leaders, to hold them to account, to control their actions. No one can say that the desire for freedom is not African, that the desire for security is not African, that the desire to control one's leaders is not African, that the desire to have a better and free life is not African. And to finish, especially not our many brothers who live quietly in Western democracies and spread in truths about what Africans really want.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And for those who thought that wasn't a good question, he proved that it was.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
So let's do this. You ask him a question, you ask Laura a question, or vice versa. Before we do the closeout, which we want to be positive, we're a little too happy. I mean, we need what's really going on. You look at the newspaper. It's not that optimistic.
Can I ask a question for
Yeah.
either or both of them? I mean, this problem of the Sahel, this string of coups, we literally have a coup belt now going
Right.
across from the Atlantic
Exactly.
Ocean to the Indian Ocean, across the southern spread of the Sahara.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a particular interest in Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. Apparently,
Yeah.
there was perhaps a coup attempt in Chad last night. There's always stuff going on. There was a very interesting poll showing that most young men who join jihadist groups in West Africa join them because it creates some economic opportunity and
Right.
something to do.
Yeah.
So what is the solution? The U.S. has overwhelmingly provided security assistance to military forces, which maybe is useful, but not obviously enough. What do we need to do to try to bring back some stability and development in the Sahel?
That's a good question. Chris, you have the answer.
Sure, I do. And if I had the opportunity, I'll make it work. Excellent question, and I think there's reason to worry. But interestingly, about a decade or 2 decades ago, every time you talked about ungovernable spaces, that political elites on the continent would take offense. And governments would say, but there's no ungovernable space in our country. Yeah. And I think what we've seen is that over the years, development has tended to be centralized in the capital city. And once you move out of the capital, you have people who are abandoned to themselves, they have no public services, they have no schools, no hospitals, and they're completely detached from the state. So when you go to them and you now talk about issues of security, they think it's the regime, it's the regime's problem. They don't see it as something to which they're connected. And so one of the solutions would be first to decentralize the states, to empower people in the rural areas and give them the resources to look out for themselves, to decentralize the security systems. For example, a local police force would probably be more effective in a locality than a national police that runs in with heavy vehicles, shoots at people, including people they don't recognize because they're not familiar with the territory. I would say take a broader, comprehensive approach to the issues of insecurity in the Sahel. It's not just a kinetic problem. You're not going to be able to resolve this solely by military means. You have to incorporate issues of employment, issues of development, services, security sector reform, and then empower the regional entities, ECOWAS and the African Union, to also lend a hand. Because I think that if these institutions work well and if people identify and if people see security as a common good for all of them, then even citizens would contribute their quota to make sure that the jihadis or the bad guys don't really get their way.
Great answer.
What I have to say about that is for 4 years, I was responsible for foreign assistance, USAID. And all that sounds good. But the practical power that donors have and the practical interests that governments have and the priorities that they set don't necessarily allow you to be logical. And there's competition and there's a legislature that you have to deal with that doesn't understand any of this. So I'm getting down before we zoom out of here. What are some of the practical next steps to take what we've been talking about and make it work? I mean, is it having a conference? No more conferences. And money is there. Now, part of the problem about money is there. The US, the UK, the UN, none of these U's want to really listen to the other to decide where their money should go. And we've tried all kinds of ways to coordinate. So I'm just saying in terms of what's practical that can happen to help the countries build the democracies that they want. And where do you start? Laura?
Yeah, well, I mean, these are big questions, and I approach them with some humility because I think they're hard to tackle. But I absolutely agree that that it's a really important question, and that the coordination and the political will are really challenging questions. But I don't think that they're insurmountable, right? And I really appreciate our colleague in Burkina Faso, and the way that you've framed it and reminded all of us, because I think the first thing is we really think about where the impetus comes from, right, and who we sort of empower at the bottom. I mean, I think we think about who should be benefiting, and then how we build projects from that. So I mean, I think we've funded things like security reform in the Sahel, and I get that and why, and I also get why that's politically make sense in, say, the United States. But I think we have to think about maybe different kinds of security reform, which comes to policing, right? If you look at Afrobarometer and other, police are the least trusted institution within particular countries, but sort of regular police, not even army and so on. So maybe there's different kinds of reform, of security, that we want to tackle in a different way, and that can sort of meet up with other kinds of youth employment, right? Again, I'm sort of thinking creatively. I think we really have to think about, different kinds of development work that we do, things like infrastructure work, and be different kinds of donors, and be brave and spend some time to educate our colleagues on the Hill and in other places, even our own citizens in the United States, about why that's important, and also how that ties back to migration. I mean, that was your point before. If we look at how Europe has funded migration in West Africa, right, it has contributed to the insecurity in West Africa, absolutely. And that has to be, that's complicated to explain to your sort of average voter, but we have to find ways to do that in ways that will then, sort of break this down, because at the end of the day, these are the sort of factors that have contributed to the breakdown of security in West Africa. The funding from outside forces themselves, right, have led to the regime collapse in Niger and so on, arguably. And different kinds of funding in a place like Niger could bolster the institutions and bolster citizens in ways that could be supportive of democracy. But I get that, politically, that requires different kinds of activities by us in the United States and in Europe.
Chris.
Well, I would just say very quickly, in the interest of time,
We're good.
I think partners should be very good at listening. And in listening, it's not just listening to the governments, to the political elites. We have to diversify the kinds of partnerships that we develop in these countries. Secondly, I think development partners have to be consistent. The issue was raised initially about double standards. For example, why do you give one regime a pass and then you go to the next door and you don't give it a pass? You've lost your ability, your voice, to be able to hold people accountable for the way in which they govern their countries. I remember, old enough to remember when, for example, when François Mitterrand was president of France, and he basically said, he made a speech in which he said development aid will be tied to countries' efforts at democratization. And that was received by the African population in Francophone Africa as a boost to their own efforts. They were already in the trenches. They just needed that umbrella of support and encouragement, and they took advantage of it. Contrast that with what we've seen in the past few years in terms of French policy in Francophone Africa, where a head of state goes into a country where a military regime is being installed and sits there while the military takes office, and then goes to the next country and says there should be no military rule.
Yeah.
So that kind of inconsistency just creates confusion and really undermines homegrown democratization efforts that are very legitimate and genuine.
Yes, Sulema.
Yeah.
He didn't want too much back and forth.
I want to add that Western countries, the USA, must avoid double standard. And I want to add that economic inequalities are the main threat to democracy. And in our context, Mali, Burkina, Niger, we could add serious security crisis and humanitarian polarities. Western partners must support African states in building viable and prosperous nation states. This is prerequisite. Above all, they must not support lame, illegitimate, and mafia-like regime in the name of real politics, ensuring them de facto lifelong powers and dynastic succession to the great detriment of their population. They must support countries in forming impartial and republican armies, which they have already done in various Sahelian countries, but which has certainly not prevented the military from overthrowing elected powers, incidentally. And to finish, all these must be done in a spirit of non-ingerence and respect of the sovereignty of countries.
Thank you very much. So we're going to do a closeout with your brilliant final remarks. So Dan, just thinking of all the things that we've talked about, what do we need to go away with?
You're setting a very high bar with brilliance, so I may have to defer to my colleagues on anything brilliant. I would say, let's take Africa seriously for intrinsic reasons. Let's understand that we're not going to live in a safe world if conflict is metastasizing across the continent. We're not going to live in a prosperous world if a quarter of its inhabitants don't achieve the kind of miracle growth that we've seen, not just in Asia, but really in every region. We are not going to run an effective foreign policy if we only gravitate to the great crises in Europe and the Pacific and the Middle East, and don't pay attention to this huge center of gravity in Africa. There is so much to work with. We literally have billions of allies on the continent as it grows into a multi-billion person population. We know, I think Suleiman said it very nicely, Africans want freedom and rights and dignity 100% as much as anyone else on earth.
Right.
Let's support that aspiration. And when we support that aspiration for democratic development and opportunity, all these other things follow. Conflict is mitigated. Violent extremism does not metastasizing. It is diminishing. Common prosperity is growing, and we live in a safer, better world.
Laura?
Well, that's a tough act to follow. Thank you for the question, and thank you to all of my colleagues for really some stimulating thoughts today about this. Yeah, I mean, I am hopeful, ever hopeful, for precisely the reasons that have been said today. I think there's so much eagerness, there's so much decades, as has been pointed out, of practice at fighting for democracy. So, as someone who sits here and as someone who teaches about comparative democracy, I take these lessons from Africa to my students and then back again. I think there's so many opportunities for partnership and exchange about how to build better democracies. And so I think that is, really what's hopeful to me is the youth and the rest of us of different generations, both in Africa and globally, particularly if we really see this as a partnership. And I think that we can and we have and will continue to do that. And I also think that, we really need to see it through kind of the longer term kind of educational and social processes wherein democracies are built. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, I would say that despite the challenges of the moment that we've talked about, I am extremely optimistic, very confident about the future of Africa, and for two reasons. The youth board, the youngest continent on the surface of the earth, the younger generation that sees themselves as citizens of the world and want to compete and succeed with citizens across the rest of the world. Secondly, the demographics. As Dan just said, 1/4 of the world's population is going to be African or people of African descent. If Nigeria stays the course with its democracy, in 20, 30 years, it will be the second largest democracy in the world. It will surpass the United States. It will come after India. There's so much potential. And if African youth and African women step forward to be counted, the continent is going to do well.
Thank you so much. And thank the four of you for taking this topic as seriously as you've done so and communicated it in a way that I think people can act. Just appreciate you and what you all do every day to make things work in support of what it is the people want and need. So with that, I think I'm going to close out and thank everybody for participating. Over and out.